Welcome to the Mental Advantage Podcast. Whether you're an athlete trying to perform at your best when it counts the most, a coach or business leader trying to get more out of your team, or someone looking for more personal growth, this is the place for you. This podcast is your map to guide you to the right mindset, systems, and strategies you need to become the best version of yourself. And now, here's John Cullen and Brandon Allen.
All right, welcome into the show. Brandon and I have had a really busy week in a good way as it relates to guests that we've had on. And I want to, Brandon, definitely start out by thanking them. Dr. Mo was on, of course, that show was aired on Friday, last Friday before the Ryder Cup. And then China McCarney was on last week. And then, of course, we had Scott Foxhall on. Speaking of China McCarney, I want to talk about, and I meant to mention this during Dr. Mo's episode, is that I had kind of promised China that we would mention each time that we air a show, the Athletes Against Anxiety and Depression Foundation, which a lot of good work. I mean, those of you who were able to listen to that show already can go back and listen to it if you haven't, but hear some of the work that the Athletes Against Anxiety and Depression Foundation that China founded is doing. It's www.aaadf.org. And speaking of that show, Brandon, I want to make a point of clarification because I mentioned this to you off the air, but there was, I went back and listened to that as I do, whether it's mowing the grass or, driving in my car, I'll listen to some of the shows back. Right. And during the China show, I realized I'd made a comment that I think some people might take out of context as I was talking about bipolar, people who are experiencing bipolar. And I said, what happens with the way I phrased it isn't the way I intended it. I was saying that, I think I said on the show that people like the idea of being close to the ceiling from a manic state, and that being close to the ceiling is just a reference that a lot of psychiatrists will use when they're talking about being at that elevated mood and that mania that you experience. And I said, it's not always a bad thing. What I meant by that is it's not always a bad thing according to the person who's experiencing bipolar, because a lot of your artists, actors, actresses, people like that in the performing arts and stuff who experience bipolar, they like the idea that when they're in that manic state, they've got a lot of energy, they've got a lot of creativity that's going on. So that's what I meant when I said, they don't mind being that close to the ceiling. The challenge for a lot of clinicians is trying to make sure they're not busting through the ceiling, because that's when you can, get into some really serious issues as far as,
And I'm glad you were able to clarify that. But I think most of the listeners understand, especially with the content of the program and the history of the program now, that kind of where you were coming from with that. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And so then we have China and Dr. Mo. Then we have Nina, that show will be airing later this week, actually, on Friday. Nina Sosman Pogue, who I can't wait for the listeners to hear her and some of the great advice I think that she gives as it relates to just resiliency and dealing with adversity. And then, of course, next week, so the following week, we're going to actually have on Tyler Zombro, who is a pitcher for the Durham Bulls. And that name may ring a bell with some of our listeners because Tyler was just all over ESPN and a lot of different news sources for a reason that he would be the first to tell you is not necessarily the reason he would ever want to be all over ESPN for. But Tyler was pitching for the Durham Bulls in a game a while back
June,
now.
Wasn't it June? Like early to mid-June, I think it was?
Yeah, I think you're right. And ended up catching every pitcher's nightmare, right? It's the batted ball that comes right back up the middle where you just don't have a time to get the glove up and it hits him in the face, in the head, really, and caused just a unbelievable beginning of a recovery, but thank the Lord he's even able to recover, because a lot of people that were at the game and people who observed it, I think there for a while were wondering if that was even going to be possible.
I mean, I think if the listeners go out and watch it, because it's still all over YouTube and Sports Center and highlights and stuff like that, it is remarkable that he's going to be able to speak with us next week. I mean, really, it's insane. And not to steal any thunder, but my understanding is he plans on pitching next year.
Right. No, I mean, and that's the thing is, you and I've had an opportunity in the area that I moved from down here to Nashville. The area of Virginia is where Tyler's from. And had an opportunity to coach against Tyler when he was playing high school baseball. And then, of course, he went on to a great career at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. And then, of course, got drafted by the Tampa Bay Rays or signed by the Tampa Bay Rays, and just had really was somebody who they expected to probably even get an opportunity here this season. So really anxious to hear just what it takes. I can't even imagine like the mindset. We talk about this all the time, right, of just being able to say, you know what, this happened, and now I'm starting to weigh my back, right? Starting to, start the path back today plus today plus today. Right. So I'm really anxious to hear about that.
Well, it's interesting because, you talk about that and it does seem to be kind of a common thread through the last few episodes of the resiliency, whether it's our buddy Fox, who, has been coaching now for 25 plus years, and started at College of Charleston when you and I were there. And we've, he speaks about it in the podcast of basically, oodles of noodles and very low salary, right? Persevered and kept going and kept grinding. And then same thing with China, overcoming some of the demons that he's had to overcome, persevering and grinding and moving on. Nina talks about the same thing in her episode. So, there's something to be said about that resiliency, and understanding that those tough times, certainly, I know it's cliche to say, but they certainly develop character. They certainly develop a perspective that allows people to be grateful. And, it's really good to see really good people overcome and have success. And, all of our recent guests have definitely had that common thread.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I always think about the, what's the poster or whatever you see about, don't prepare the path for your child, prepare your child for the path, sure, right? Sure, like yeah. And I think you're spot on. It's all of these experiences, or as the listeners will hear Nina talk about this, a big this, and not everything is a big deal, but it's, it does it all of those things that we look back on and we're like, wow, this is, such a big deal. It was, and it is, and most of the time we'll get through it. But it, like to your point, it definitely prepares you for that to come up again, in the future.
It does, and I think there are definitely again, not to take or give the Cliff's Notes version of Nina's episode, but those thises, the big thises, as you get in, as those become a little more distant and in the rear view, they're not as big and pronounced as they are when you're in it. They're still big as it pertains to your life and can be certainly life changing. But I think the folks that are resilient and realize that this has happened and now what do I do? are usually better equipped later on. And I think the ones that really come out of it and succeed on the other side is and this has really kind of become one of my favorite words, curious. And they're curious about why was I here? And if you have the thought of there is a God or higher power or whatever the listener may believe in from a faith perspective, there's probably a reason that you were put in that situation. And typically, we've talked about this before, you're only going to be given as much as you can handle. And you're probably a pretty strong-willed, strong faith person to be going through it. And those that embrace that really do a tremendous job as you get done and you come out of it.
Absolutely. No, I think it's an interesting thing. And it's one of those things that as people talk about, like, this idea of what could have happened did happen, is that, to your point about that faith perspective is, if we believe that everything happens for a reason, you hear people say this all the time or whatever, it's also important for us not to look at things and think of like, well, if I had just done this, then this would have been different. Or if I had just done that, a lot of times those things are happening for a reason. So, like you say, so it's really a good reminder for the listeners that you bring up there.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about, you brought up, Scott Foxhall earlier. Let's talk about maybe some of the things that we picked up from that show, because as I mentioned, going back and listening to some of these shows, I like to do that because I get an opportunity to really, it's amazing. It's like anything else. Anytime you're in a conversation and then all of a sudden you find out later on, like later on, somebody brings something up from that conversation. Sometimes you miss something. And that's why I like to go back and listen to some of these shows. But a couple of the things that Fox brought up on that particular episode that I really thought was great was, and I think this is a great lesson for a lot of the coaches. And I know we have a lot of people who are not just coaches out there listening to the show, but business leaders, is meeting the player where they are. That was a message that really resonated with me throughout that particular episode, was just how important it is as a coach to adjust to the player skill sets and mindset, and making sure that you're not trying to, as Fox said, make them the best version of you, but you really want to focus on just making them the best version of themselves.
For sure. And I think that takes also, though, a mature coach, right? I mean, that comes through a lot of failure and life lessons, right?
Yeah.
Hey, I've tried it to do it my way with this certain set of players or individuals, and it's different. And I think, even from a parental standpoint, every child you have is different. Everybody has the nuances and things like that. And it's interesting because it's something that I've learned, and it's something that in the past couple of years as a coach that I have tried to have the player identify, because these are younger players, younger kids, and I try to have them identify and say, what is it? Number one, how do you learn? Right? Are you a reader? Are you, there's a couple of different ways to learn and to absorb. And, do you need to be shown things? Do you right. If you hear it, are you good? Like there's all, because that's how I am. Like if you tell me something and I hear it, I got it. If you make me go read it and try to keep it in, I can do it, but I'm gonna have to do it 2 or 3 times. So it's part of that is understanding thyself, right? Know thyself. And then the other part is, as a coach, how can I encourage you, right? Do you need a cheerleader? Do you need the foot in your ass? Do you need because everybody gets encouraged or or gets those competitive juices flowing a different way. And as a coach, I think you have to identify that even at a young age, right?
Yeah.
And so anyway, I love that about Fox. And we talked about it on the show. It does not surprise me at all that he's having the success that he's having.
Right. No, I think you just brought up something that I really hope everybody takes a note of, because it's what I refer to as the coaching GPS. It's so important, and Fox even talked about this on the show. It's so important. So you substitute parent, coach, business leader, whatever you want to for that coach piece of this. But it's understanding that when he talks about when he goes out onto the mound to have a conversation with the pitchers, that he takes a moment to assess where they are in their, whether they, to your point, need, the foot in the ass, or you need to have that crucial conversation, as we would say as business leaders, or they need you to be there, sit there and support them. But the biggest thing is assess that first, because if you just come in there and already are kind of starting your coaching or your direction or whatever the case would be, sometimes you're going to lose that player. And I refer to it as the coaching GPS, because in teaching some managers in the past, I would always say that, and I use this analogy, and I might have said this before on the show, but it's worth repeating for anybody who hasn't heard it, is if I were to call you right now and I would say, Brandon, I'm in downtown Atlanta, I'm lost. What's the first question you're going to ask me is, where are you? Like, where specifically are you? Because in order for you to give me directions, I need to let you know where I am. And it's the same thing with the coaching GPS is you have to assess where that player is, or that employee, or whoever,
right,
before you can start. But a lot of people come in and they just start giving directions, and they're
predisposed, right?
Yeah,
And it's kind of like we do as individuals sometimes, is we're so concerned about what we have to say. We think what we have to say is so important, instead of going, hey, maybe I really don't have to say anything.
right.
Maybe I just need to be out there as a safety blanket, and let them kind of talk about it and work it through their own head. You may not have to say a thing, right?
Yeah.
Because they may say something, and then all of a sudden they go, oh, okay.
Right. Exactly.
Now, okay, I'm good. So
yeah. I think it goes back to, and we've mentioned this before, how there's so much overlap between our guests over, show 47 was the one we just did with Dr. Mo, is the fact that, Tyler Pazik and Ask More, Tell Less for coaches, that was one of the same themes is, find out, ask those questions before you just come in, because the old school coaching model, the old school parenting model, I mean, there's common themes throughout the old school business model. Isn't it interesting that those three authority figures, parent, coach, and boss, used to all have the same approach of I'm just going to tell you because I'm the manager, I'm the parent, I'm the coach, and that's the way it's going to be.
And really at the end of it, it's an ego play, because the only thing that most of those have in common is that you're a little older,
right?
That you've maybe experienced a little more, but your experience may not be half of what that person you're talking to has already experienced, right? So from an empathy perspective, they may have already gone through so much to shape their life that you as a manager or as a coach, or even a parent at times, can't really grasp. So cut them some slack, and we talked about this right with China. Be graceful. Show some grace and be graceful as you kind of help them navigate whatever it is that they're going through, and see what kind of results you get. I think a lot of people would be surprised that you can actually get more and better results with less authoritarian stance and more graceful stance.
No, it's spot on. And look, don't just because that was the way you were raised or that was the way that you had a boss that way or a coach that way, doesn't have to repeat the cycle. As China talked about some of his coaches and how important it was to make sure as a leader that you always are demonstrating some of that mental leadership, as he called it, where you're asking those questions, you're checking in with people, and not just like toughen up, just you figure it out or whatever, because you can, be the change, right? I mean, you can be like, just because that's the way you had it as you maybe had a parent or a coach or a boss that way. If you didn't think that was that great, then be the change. Can start with you, So speaking of China, I really liked, and I want to dive into this a little bit because I know you watched this same Netflix special, because when you were talking about this on the show, you had brought it. So on the China show, what I'm talking about is that China was talking about how much time and money is spent on skill development. Like at a young age, every parent falls into the same thing, right? Let's spend the money, let's get the hours of instruction, we get all this stuff done, but they don't factor in the one mental aspect of it. And at the end of the day, when you project all of these athletes into the future, the one differentiator, the one thing that separates them is the mental skills, who has that mental resilience, that mental toughness, however you want to frame it. And I had seen that Netflix special you were talking about, Breaking
Marty
Point.
Fish?
Yeah, with Marty Fish.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because actually, and I went back and rewatched it. And it was interesting that, so on that point that China was making about skill development, one of these trainers, I guess it was the coach, and I forget the guy's name. He was like at that Saddlewood training facility where like all of the young players, USA tennis players like Andy Roddick and Marty Fish was there. But it, of course, even coming back to use that facility with Sampras and Courier and some of them. Yeah, but one of the guys they interviewed, what he says, we really believe mental toughness is the defining thing about them as competitors. He said and then he goes on, he says, we went on to say they really have to be intentional about working at it because it's not instinctual. For a young person, it's not instinctual. So you've got to be really intentional about bringing that up. But what a crazy, I mean, if you guys that are tuned into this show, if something made you tune into Mental Advantage podcast and you've been a routine listener, I would highly encourage you to go out and watch that Netflix special, because it's really, I mean, I don't want to give it away for a lot of people, but some of the parallels between that particular episode of Untold Story and what China was talking about was so key.
Well, and that's why I kind of brought it up is it is, and it's more frequent than I think the listener understands.
Yeah.
I know as a coach going out either into the field of competition, whether that's a football field or a basketball court or a baseball field. And let's take that same example that, you talk about with Scott. And I've kind of coached all ages, right? As small as 5 is up to 20, and I know you've done the same. You can tell when a player has lost that happy spot, and I know you and I have talked about it before, where I have absolutely kept kids on teams who needed the team more than the team needed him.
Yep.
Kind of a thing.
Yep.
And it's something that when you recognize and you see as a coach, as a parent, as a leader, you have to pay attention to it.
Yeah.
You have got to find a way to, especially at that point, and there's no other way of putting it than soothe them. Yeah. Right? Like you literally just have to kind of talk them back a little bit and let's get back into having some fun, and let's remember what we're doing out here. And Revisa talks about, a lot of people talk about, let's remember our why.
Yeah.
Right. In those moments. But yeah, it's really interesting. It's a great documentary. Marty Fish was, and even Andy Roddick, both, who were prominent in it, were very, very candid, and a tip of the cap to them for opening up about some of the struggles there. So yeah, I mean, it was it's interesting for sure.
That opening up, it was a really key piece to that too, because you think about it with everything that's gone on now, where you're seeing more and more athletes come out and admit some of these challenges that they've been facing. That stigma, what I thought was really interesting about that documentary was how it illuminated the stigma that was still going on at that time. Because, if you remember when he decides so after he comes back, he has the mental issues and stuff, and kind of gets himself to a point where he feels like he can come back and talk about it, or wants to at least go public with it. I thought it was really interesting that his mom and dad, his dad's like, because Marty Fish says, look, I had trained myself to show no weakness, and this was one of those things I was afraid to let people know about because it would be considered a weakness. So there's the stigma. Now the fuel on the stigma is then they interview his dad, and his dad says, hey, I didn't want him to talk about it because it's a weakness, right? And his mom even jumps in and is like, yeah, it's considered a weakness for the athletes. And I'm thinking, well, these are the two people that would have been in his corner, right? That are both saying, instead of like, hey, you should go tell somebody, they're like, don't say anything.
Well, not only that, but we talk about they are the first mental coach.
Yeah.
And here's what was amazing about China, and what I'm so grateful for, is the way that he opened up on our podcast, because certainly our guests don't have to do that.
Right.
And we've been very fortunate and very blessed that most of the guests do open up about some times that just aren't great. Right. They just aren't. And some of them have enough, like we talked about, rear view mirror time, that they can talk about it, and it's okay. And you can tell with some that it's still raw. It's
right.
So I was extremely grateful for China for opening up the way that he did. I thought it was a great conversation.
Yeah, you made me think about Chris Gingrich is somebody that,
for sure.
Some of our, like you say, some of our guests that have been very candid, Chris Vasami, some of them have been very candid about those struggles. And I have to believe it's helped. And and you and I have had this conversation off the air, is that, when we jokingly say all the time, like, oh, the two people listening or whatever, thankfully it's more than that, because we probably wouldn't still be doing the show if it wasn't. But the reality of it is, if it was just one person that listened to Chris Gingrich, or listened to China McCarney, or listened to Chris Vasami, or
even Hively, RJ Hively was the same way. Yeah.
RJ Hively that have had those struggles and been vulnerable enough to come on and share that, and really shine the light on the fact that there's a path out, right? There's a place. And that's what I love so much about, Athletes Against, Anxiety and Depression Foundation that China started, and why we both agreed to kind of get behind that from at least a show exposure standpoint, is because that work that they're doing there with, a lot of those funds going to pay for people to get help or therapy or whatever. And we've talked about on this show, in 47 shows, this has probably come up in 40 of them, as far as how key therapy and different things like that is. So I really support that kind of.
There's no question about that. And then the last thing that I would say to this, that even Nina brings up in her show, is For the listener that's struggling a little bit, realize that life is long, right? That what you're going through will not last forever. You really will come out the other end of it, and most of the time you're going to come out better. So, be patient, find help, lean into whatever healthy ways of coping and dealing with things are, and certainly, we're here as a resource as well, so they can always reach out to us, through email or listening, or even on the social media platforms. If people need to reach out, then reach out.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think it's one of those things that we probably don't mention enough, but you're exactly right. I mean, if you have to reach out to somebody, we're here. And you're right. I can't wait for people to listen to the Nina episode, because just the way she lays things out, I think it's really, it's just the perspective. We talk all the time about being perspective coaches as much as anything else. And it's just kind of, I like some of the strategy she has, that she puts people in perspective. Speaking, I should say, of perspective, we had our good buddy, Dr. Mo, back on Friday's show.
Yeah, we did.
And, we talked to him, of course, as people have probably heard by now, about the Ryder Cup and all of the different nuances and the different mentality, if you will, that has to, be prevalent in a player who is used to being that individual scorer, mm-hmm. who's now on a team aspect, and they're not used to being in that team aspect. And sometimes, and we didn't really get into this with him, but sometimes it's also takes him so out of character, because, I meant to ask him about like that player who is traditionally a little bit more reserved, is a little bit more quiet. And now you can't help but to get caught up in some of the emotions of the crowd and the rah piece to it. And I wonder what that does to them, right? Like, it's like, because it takes them out, it's got to take them out of their game a little bit.
No, it does. And, but I think what's interesting is, especially in golf and some of the other, what I would consider individual sports, right? There's a level of being you can still be an individual and be successful in your own way. I don't know that the emotion of an event sometimes takes them out. I mean, I agree with you, but I think that may just be, you talk about perspective. I think that just may be how you and I are, that a bigger crowd, a little more noise, even if it's booing, right? It gives you something. I think some of the individuals, they may not react to that, but I tell you where I think they would have a very difficult time, to your point, is, man, when it's a team setting and you've got to do something that is a sacrifice
mm-hmm.
for somebody else, that's different.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a completely different mindset. And I don't know, you and I both had teammates where that they weren't, it was not big team first.
Right.
It wasn't, and it was apparent. And again, as a coach, I can tell you right now that those kids don't get invited back.
No.
And they may be really good.
Yep. And
I would rather have a team than, 12 kids and a cancer.
Yeah.
I just,
what do you think causes this? Because I think you're spot on. Like, we experienced it to some level when we were playing, of course, but we also policed it to some level ourselves, right? Like, we made sure that we were taking care of things and that we weren't, that's what always amazes me is I'm more amazed, I guess, as a coach, as a parent, as an observer now looking at teams playing and thinking to myself, I can't believe that team's allowing that guy to act like that. Like everybody else, I think a lot of times looks at the player and is like, man, that's so selfish. I can't believe that guy's acting like that. My instinct, and I don't know about you, B, but my instinct is like, why is the team allowing, where is the leadership? Where are the people who aren't stepping up being like, dude, that's not going to work. Like, we're going to fix this.
That's a great question. And we don't have enough time. That actually could be its own episode, but here's my condensed answer. At some point, parents have fostered an environment where the kid runs the show, right?
Yeah.
The mom or dad is not the head of the household. There's probably a very little discipline, or there's very little humility that's been shown, or they may have an older or younger sibling, usually older, that the parents they've just grown up in this ego driven environment, and it's probably why a coach tolerates it to an extent, because they're probably dealing with an older version of the kid. And, until you can run them off or get them off the team, it is what it is. And so my point is this, though: why does the team tolerate it? Is this: parents do not allow their kids, right, to figure stuff out anymore. You talked about it earlier.
Yeah.
They prepare the path. They don't prepare the child.
Yep. And
kids nowadays are so concerned about how they're perceived with their peers.
Yep.
You look at it in social media, you look at it wherever, you don't have, or it's rare that you have a kid who's willing to step up and say, hey man, I don't like that. I'm not down with that. It's not good for the team. It's not the culture that you agreed to. And so we've talked about it before, where, the best teams are coach directed and player led. There's very few players that are willing to lead and be that, for lack of a better term, either enforcer. You can call it asshole. I would call it leader.
Right.
Because
captain,
the kid that's not, the kid that's being selfish, the kid that's not being humble, that's the team asshole.
Agreed.
And, but I think kids today are so concerned about the blowback that, I might lose a follower, or, someone's going to say that I was this, that, or the other. It really, really, really cuts the leadership legs out from somebody when you're really concerned about their opinion rather than their effort and their result. Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you made me think about this when you were just talking about that, because one of my favorite signs I saw at a youth sports complex was the sign, and you've seen it make its rounds around the internet, is, whether your player is the star of the game today, or whether they are the, get the college scholarship, all these things is no reflection on you as a parent. But whether or not that person is uncoachable, is a horrible teammate, is, a pain in the ass for the umpires or whatever, that is a direct reflection on you as a parent. Like, so if you're keeping score at home, like so many parents do,
right,
And that's the column you want to make sure you have all of the checks, the boxes checked in, is the one. They're a good teammate. They're coachable. They listen. They respect the umpires. They respect authority or whatever. And this is, and I know you and I could talk about this for days because we have before, but I think that you hit it on the head with all of the things you said. The other thing I think that has started to deteriorate was that bit of authority piece that you're talking about, because it starts with little things, right? Little things become big things. It's what you resist persists, right? And it's one of those things that if you think about, like, the analogy I always use all the time is when we were growing up, we used to call everybody Mr. or Mrs. and coach or whatever, right?
Yeah.
We never, ever called, like, I would never go to a friend's house and say, hey, Tom, what's going on? Talking to the person's dad.
Or
right?
even a teacher. I don't know that I knew any of my teachers' first names, and I sure as hell weren't going to call them like Mr. Bob or Miss, Miss Jessica. That wasn't happening.
Yeah. But when you start allowing those things to happen, because like you said, it's like, it's somewhere along the line, a switch was flipped where everybody was like, well, let's not put so much pressure on him to do this, or let's not make him do that. Like, there's a difference between putting pressure on a kid that's making it uncomfortable for them on things that just don't make sense. But when it comes to respecting authority, and when it comes to, like you said, about, not allowing them to fail, because, we see it. I don't know, like you said, that's a whole bigger topic, because you just see it so prevalent in school systems, and you see it in athletics or whatever. Is soon as the kid doesn't make the team, soon as the kid doesn't make the good grade on the test or whatever, right away the parent's going in there, talking to the coach, talking to the teacher. And it's not, what did my child do that they need to do better?
Right.
It is directly, what did you do that has him so upset or her so upset or whatever?
And so, and right. And really at the end of the day, it's probably more about the parent being embarrassed and not being able to tell and, chat it up with the neighbors about this, that, or the other. It's interesting. There's a couple of things that I know my kids have heard me say it, and maybe I'm a bad parent for saying it, but I've told them before, like, number one, my job is to make sure I don't let loose 3 assholes into the world, right? Like that's my job.
Yeah.
So as a parent, whatever my why is, as a parent, yes, I love you. Yes, I'm going to support you, and yes, I'm going to do everything in my ability to help you learn how to navigate life, right? They will all tell you, and it's the small things, and I'll be like, hey, okay, this is a really good life lesson. And they're like, oh my God. And they'll roll their eyes and all that. The other thing that I will say is, and they've all heard this before, I will never, ever go talk to a coach about your playing time or you making a team or not making a team, because I've been there, and I can assure you the kids, if you're a kid, and here's something that I'd like the parents to think about. If the only reason your child is on a team is because of the coach being scared of either having to deal with you, or because you have approached the coach and he's thinking, sure, I'll give him a uniform as long as I don't have to deal with listening to you blather about him or her being on the team. Yeah, I'll give you a uniform.
Yeah.
Do you think that puts your child in the best opportunity to succeed? Right. Maybe they were supposed to get cut. Maybe they were supposed to learn how to persevere through this challenge. Maybe they were supposed to not play football and get into the band, because that is actually where their natural God-given talent lies. Yeah. Maybe it's something bigger than you. And that's where I think parents in general, we fall down and we lose track of, and we talk about it with Nina. They're this, they're big, this, they're getting cut, them not playing, whatever. That's theirs to own. That's not you to own.
Yeah.
That's theirs. And if you try to own it, you're stealing something away from your kids. And as a parent, I would say most parents, and it's not that they're being malicious with it, but like you mentioned earlier, flip the script a little bit. And if I said, hey, would you go steal money from your kid? Would you go steal this, that, or the other from your kid? I think most parents would be like, no, what are you talking about? Are you stupid? Then don't steal an opportunity to learn from them either. Don't take failure from them.
Yeah.
Allow them to experience that. Don't rob them of that opportunity. It's being selfish as a parent if you do.
Yeah. And for the people listening, so two things I want to say before we wrap this up is for people listening and they're like, where is this going with mental advantage? It's all mindset. Like these things that you're training them now, if you train them if you go in and you fight that battle for them and you don't let them own that, and you all of a sudden are in there talking to that coach for them or talking to that teacher for them or whatever. And to your point, Brandon, if you're not allowing them to own it, well, now all of a sudden, fast forward 20 years and that boss is hard on them, or that teacher, in college, that professor doesn't give them a good grade. And oh, by the way, that professor in college, for you parents, they're not listening to your phone call. So don't even bother trying to call them. But that's the point, is you're not preparing them for the future. And then the other thing I will say about that, this whole idea, because this is what, in dealing with parents as we have as coaches, you hear is, I think what happens is people fall into this cycle of, well, everybody else is doing it. All the other parents are going and talking to the coaches. All the other parents are going and talking to the teachers or whatever. The reality of it is you can still be the change. Like you don't have to, and like if you're going to be strict on your kids about respecting authority by saying Mr. Allen and Mr. Cullen, that's a good thing. Like, don't fall victim to that peer pressure just because all of the other parents aren't making their kids say, the right thing to that, show that respect, demonstrate that respect to the parents. So that's something, our kind of, advice for the week, if you will. It seems like every so often we'll get on a run on parents, but we're not saying we do it perfectly by any stretch of the imagination.
Oh, no. I could, I got
that's a whole other show.
I got 4 hours worth of,
right.
But to that end, I have failed as a parent. I have done things that I've had to learn from and go, man, if I could do that again, I would do it this way. And, it's for sure.
Spot on. Well, listen, man, it was always a good time when we love having the guests, but I also really love when we have an opportunity just to kind of reflect on some of the things that we've learned along with the audience, because, we say all the time that, we're listeners too. We just happen to be involved in the conversation, but, every show we've done, I know you and I are both writing down notes and
I've got notebooks full of stuff from our guests. It's amazing.
Yeah. So it's really good for us to just be able to take a moment to reflect on some of those things and talk about that. But again, Nina Sossaman Pogue coming up on Friday's show. Really looking forward to that. We're creeping up on show number 50. So we thank you guys for tuning into those. And as we started off the show, and we'll finish the show talking about China McCarney's foundation, Athletes Against Anxiety and Depression Foundation. Make sure you're going to that website, www.aaadf.org, and make sure you're getting the mental health manual that's available on there as well.
One thing that I don't know that we have updated everybody on, and we'll keep it brief, is we are relaunching some of the social media stuff, some of the social media platforms, so go out there and take a look. We'll have a little more content. And I don't know, as a 48-year-old man, that I'm going to admit this, but we now have a TikTok channel.
That's right.
And holy shit, what? So, we'll be putting clips up there as well. No, I can assure you there won't be any dances. There won't be any trending whatevers. But we will be putting clips up there too. And it's just Mental Advantage Podcast. So check it out.
Awesome. Good deal, man. Hey,
right,
have a great weekend. I'll talk to you.
Want to provide feedback or stay up to date with the show? Visit our Instagram page at Mental Advantage Podcast, or you can send us an email at podcast@mentaladvantage.net. To have John Cullen work with you or your team, please write to him at john.cullen@mentaladvantage.net. Thanks for listening to today's episode.